define the modern South. Poverty amidst plenty, power and powerlessness. Southerners, because of their experience, had access to insights about life that were not available to people who had grown up in other parts of the country, but Southerners also had a set of blinders that guided the way they saw the world that did not affect people from other parts of the country. So when I began my own journey into the history of the modern South back in the 1980s, I found Woodward's idea of irony and paradox to be very appealing, very powerful, and it certainly was reinforced by my own experiences. So in 1986, for instance, Secor, the U.S. subsidiary of a German technology firm, began a national recruiting program designed to attract skilled workers, to attract educated, technical people to its headquarters in North Carolina. And Secor's ads linked the state's research triangle, which already by the 1980s was an area that had the densest population, the highest percentage of PhDs per capita of any place in the country. Secor's ads, as you can see, linked North Carolina to California's Silicon Valley in particular, but more broadly to California and its image of prosperity and modernity and just plain cool. The ad seemed to say that North Carolina, if you were willing to turn your eye a certain way, could be regarded as California East. And something like that seemed to testify that by the 1980s, Southern change had come at last. And yet, that very same year, 1986, the Southern Growth Policies Board, which was an outfit designed to promote just the kind of modern, high-tech, Sun Belt prosperity that Secor was touting in its ad, published this report, Halfway Home and a Long Way to Go. A report that made clear just how far the South, even the seemingly booming Sun Belt South of the 1980s, had to go if it were to meet the national standards for education, for economic opportunity, for social justice. And the board's chairman, the young governor of Arkansas named Bill Clinton, expressed, as you might expect, he expressed his characteristic optimism about the South's ability to get that other halfway home, but he confessed that the road ahead would be difficult, and that there were some populations, some groups of people, and some areas of the South that remained impoverished, uneducated, even undernourished. Well, another Southern governor who had turned U.S. president, Jimmy Carter, had sounded similar themes 15 years earlier, noting not only the moral and human costs of this regional backwardness, of this not quite being up to national standards in these ways, but also the economic costs, what he called the financial price that the region paid for its legacies of poverty and discrimination. So for me, as a graduate student in the 1980s, that seeming paradox, the coexistence of, on the one hand, poverty, deep, persistent poverty, and on the other hand, rapid high-tech growth, of furiously fast-paced transformations in the ways people were living their lives and the expectations they had, and on the other hand, these nagging, persistent inequalities and inequities. That paradox fascinated me, and I wanted to understand it. I hoped that I could even explain it. And then, of course, over the years, the subsequent career of that governor we saw before, Bill Clinton, highlighted yet another paradox, another irony. One that Woodward, in fact, had identified way back in 1968. And that was that the South, so long outside the centers of national power, whether we think about political power, economic power, cultural power, so long an outcast region, had, in the 1960s, for the first time in over a century, placed one of its own in the White House. Now, what Woodward could not have anticipated in 1968 when he wrote the essay that I'm quoting from here. But, of course, was that the election of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was that Southerner in the White House that he saw, that the election of Lyndon Baines Johnson would not be a one-off, that it would establish a pretty long-term trend. For between 1964 and the election of Barack Obama in 2008, every man elected President of the United States came from either the South or from Southern California. That is, they came from the sort of below the belt, below the wasteland part of the United States that you can see outlined on this map. And in fact, from the late 60s forward, the political and increasingly the economic and cultural influence of the region sometimes called the Sun Belt seemed astounding. Something that would have been almost impossible to imagine even as recently as the mid-1960s. So for example, throughout his entire public career, Lyndon Johnson believed, he felt a prejudice against Southerners in national life, a tendency for Yankees to dismiss the South, to see it as backward, primitive, savage, to see it backward economically, because of its underdevelopment and its widespread poverty, but also to see it backward politically in its long tradition of one-party rule and domination by strongmen and demagogues. But also, of course, backward socially in the brutal facts of Southern segregation. So in the minds of most Americans, certainly into the 1970s, maybe I would say even into the 1980s, the South remained a place you drove through on the way to Florida beaches, a place you drove through careful to remain on the interstates to avoid back roads where you might run into who knows who and who knows what. So what I'd like to do today then is to analyze the seemingly remarkable rise of the Sun Belt and to try to explain some of the paradoxes posed by the region's growing political influence after the 1960s, posed by historians like C. Vann Woodward. The seemingly unexplainable combination of the Secor ad, California East, and the report of the Southern Growth Policies Board, halfway home and a long way to go. More precisely, what I'd like to do is to kind of take on the four tasks that I outline up here. So first, I want to examine how Sun Belt power and regional conflict, that is the so-called Frost Belt, Sun Belt battle, emerged in the 1970s. And then I want to go back in time a little bit and investigate the roots of this conflict, to look at the dimensions of Southern regional change from World War II until the 1970s. Then third, I want to examine the implications of the rise of the Sun Belt for American politics and race relations. And then finally, if we have time, we'll think briefly about what many commentators called the Americanization of the South and the Southernization of America. That is the growing cultural influence of the Sun Belt South as we get closer to our own time. So let me start by returning to the late 1960s when Richard Nixon won the presidency, a prize that had long eluded him. He had been trying to become president for quite some time. And Nixon owed his victory, in some small measure at least, to a so-called Southern strategy mapped out by a young political analyst named Kevin Phillips. Well, after Election Day, the young political guru brought out as a book his compilation of strategy memos, charts, graphs, political strategy. The book was called The Emerging Republican Majority. It was published in early 1969. And in that book, Phillips coined a new term, the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt, Phillips identified as a booming region stretched of course, the belly of the continent of the United States. This is the Sun Belt according to Wikipedia today, but for Phillips, it basically included Virginia, North Carolina, all of Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, kind of went like this. Sort of as we said, kind of if you could imagine the United States wearing a belt, it would be all the part below the belt. And this zone, Phillips said, was attracting people, attracting factories, attracting investment dollars from the old industrial heartland of the Northeast and the upper Midwest. And as its population grew, Phillips predicted, the Sun Belt would initiate a massive realignment in American politics. That is, Phillips portrayed the emerging South and Southwest as the seedbed of a potential conservative majority in the United States, as a foundation for a generation of conservative Republican dominance in national politics. Well, at almost the same time that Phillips was coming up with these ideas, a few years later, another writer, coming from a very different point of view, reached very similar conclusions. So this is Phillips on the left, and on the right is Kirkpatrick Sale. Sale was a radical. He was a veteran of the 1960s radical New Left, but he also detected the rise of the Sun Belt, what he called the power shift in American life, away from the Northeastern establishment and toward the Southern rim. And this map, which we showed you before, is from his book called Power Shift. So the pillars of the Sun Belt, the pillars of the Southern rim, the basis for its spectacular economic growth, its population growth, and therefore for its growing political power, according to Sale, the pillars on which that were built were these 5 things. Agribusiness, by which he meant large-scale, mechanized corporate agriculture. Defense, both military bases, but especially defense contractors, defense industry. Technology, especially aerospace technology. Oil, and real estate, especially leisure and retirement real estate development. Well, atop these 5 pillars, Sale charged, there was built what he called a conservative, reactionary, racist cowboy culture, which he believed was coming to dominate American life, American politics, economic life, American culture. This was a place, the Southern Rim was a place, Sale said, where the 3 R's dominated. Dominated by the 3 R's. Not reading, writing, and arithmetic, oh no, but racism, rightism, and repression. So whether you cheered this development, thought it was wonderful like Phillips did, or feared it like Kirkpatrick Sale, there was little doubt by the 1970s that the Sun Belt, and especially within it a resurgent, conservative, and potentially Republican white South, had become a force to be reckoned with in national life. And in fact, this growing attention to Sun Belt power was not something that was confined to the pages of a few political books in the 1970s. There emerged a heated debate between the Sun Belt and the Frost Belt, or sometimes called the Rust Belt. That is the industrial heartland of the Northeast and Midwest. So the Sun Belt South boomed during the 1970s, a period of general economic stagnation and decline, a period while the old industrial heartland faced very steep decline. And in fact, in 1976, as the nation prepared to celebrate its bicentennial, the New York Times devoted a 4-part series to the resurgence of the South. All day and through the lonely night, the paper reported, the moving vans pushed southward, the 14-wheeled boxcars of the highway changing the face of America. As the United States approaches its bicentennial, a restless and historic movement is shifting people and power away from the northern states that had dominated American life since the nation's birth. And in the 70s, regional conflict once again became a subject of national media attention. Business Week magazine even ran a cover story with the headline was the Second War Between the States. Now this battle was not fought over slavery and union, of course, but actually it was being fought over government spending, government largesse. Specifically, it revolved around a rather obscure statistic called the Federal Balance of Payments. Leaders of the Frost Belt complained that their states paid in the lion's share in federal taxes, even though most of that money was spent in the South and the Southwest. So the Frost Belt had an unfavorable federal balance of payments, which means that they actually paid in more dollars in taxes than they received in federal spending, while the Sun Belt had a favorable balance. The opposite was the case. And northern leaders blamed this imbalance for the decline of the Rust Belt and for all of that southwesterly migration of people, jobs, and money during the 1960s and 1970s. One of the leaders of the Frost Belt counteroffensive was the governor of New York State at the time, a man named Hugh Carey, pictured here. And Carey warned that if federal spending was not redirected toward the north, if we did not reverse the decline of the Frost Belt, then the north would become, these are Carey's words, a great national museum where tourists would see industrial plants as artifacts and visit the great railroad stations where the trains used to run. Now that might seem like overheated politicians' language, but if any, I don't know, when you go to New York, if you visit the South Street Seaport, once a working seaport, now a tourist attraction, or if you go to St. Louis and visit Union Station, once the great railroad terminal, now a shopping mall, you'll see that maybe he was not too far off the mark. Well, the Arab oil embargoes, when the petroleum exporting countries of the Middle East cut off oil sales to the United States in 1973 and again in 1979, only intensified the emergency. Skyrocketing gas prices brought hardship to the Northeast and the Midwest, while down in the oil patch in the energy-rich southwestern states of Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, prosperous new arrivals pasted bumper stickers on their cars in response to the anguished cries for help of people like New York's Hugh Carey. Let them freeze in the dark, these bumper stickers proclaimed. And some new arrivals in the Sun Belt, including the Texas band Focal Minority, celebrated the distress of the Rust Belt. So here's their 1978 song, and it's called Freeze a Yankee. I don't know why we're not hearing it. Let's see. Oh, hold on.
Drive 75 and freeze 'em alive, freeze!
There you go. All right. Yeah. So this is from 1978. You found the 45 RPM single in a record store.
Freeze a Yankee, drive 75 and freeze 'em alive, freeze a Yankee. Let the thermostat rise and give 'em a surprise. Governor Briscoe promised us that if any damn Yankee raised a fuss, he'd turn off the gas, cut off the oil, and let 'em all freeze and boil. They go swanning on the rig around their seashore, Lord, it's a terrible sight. And don't you try to drill in their dirty old water. If you do, you're in for a fight. Senator Kennedy told me himself that he wouldn't let us drill on the continental shelf. So when they try to get Texas to drill another well, we can tell them all to go to Hyannisport.
So, this controversy sort of peaked in the mid-1970s when Governor Carey organized an organization. It was called the Coalition of Northeast Governors to lobby Washington to get more generous aid. And at the very same time, a caucus of about 200 members of Congress organized the Midwest Northeast Economic Advancement Coalition, which was also dedicated to try to redirect federal dollars to the north.